Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, Wendigo. It all began almost a year ago when I went through my girlfriend's computer after she began acting odd. Initially, I thought she was cheating on me, but what I found, it was worse. It's been months since we finally put that hell behind us, but I still feel uneasy at night. Almost 1 year ago, my girlfriend was kidnapped, and the police had no luck with the case. I moved in with my 2 friends, Reagan and Jim. My girlfriend began sending me weird texts, and we all got scared. One night, Reagan and Jim went to the movies and didn't come back. A week after their disappearance, Reagan showed up at the house, bloodied and naked. She told me about how she and Jim were drugged. She told me how she was kept in a basement and how she was raped. She told me she saw another girl in that basement. I knew it. I knew it was Victoria. 2 days after Reagan got home, we set off to find this house of horror. After she told me everything that happened to her, she told me she knew where she was being kept. I have one distinct memory while being transported. A stop sign. It had a cross street on it. I read it. Whitney Ranch and Patrick Lane. She paused for a moment before continuing. The basement wall was all brick. All the houses around here are made of stucco. I bet it sticks out like a sore thumb. I was skeptical. A kidnapper wants to blend in. Whatever the fuck this thing, or this guy, is, he's not holed up in some brick mansion. Why the fuck not? She asked. How many weird-ass houses do you see every day you drive? Do you barge in there demanding to know if there are any prisoners in the basement? Shit. Let's go there and fuck this guy up. Right? You're probably thinking that we should just call the police. The thing is, the last time I called the police, I found a severed finger in my house. The next time I called the police, Reagan and Jim were kidnapped. When I called the police again, Reagan was delivered to my doorstep in an absolutely disgusting condition, on the verge of death. Well, before we had our talk, we found something else in the house. A whole hand, and a note. More police begets more limbs. So we went to Patrick and Whitney. We saw no mysterious brick house. We searched the surrounding neighborhood every day that week. Finally, we found it. A house made of brick, just like Reagan said. It was small, 1 story tall. It was unkempt, but that's not saying much in this neighborhood. Aside from the building material, the house looked like any other house on the block. Reagan looked nervous, and I sure as hell didn't want to be here. So I told her, you know we can still go back, right? He has Jim, Alex. Fuck. That may have been Jim's hand. That girl with me in there, that could have been Victoria. She was right. Do we knock? I asked.
Fuck no.
We wait. Our car was parked on the other side of the road adjacent to the house. We waited and waited. Reagan assured me that the kidnapper, a man who called himself Wendigo, left the home at least once a day. We watched the place in shifts during nightfall. Finally, around 4 a.m., the front door opened. I shook Reagan awake. Someone walked out of the house. A tall man. The guy had to be at the very least 7 feet tall. He was skinny, and he was wearing a tuxedo. It was ripped and ragged. Holy shit. I said, he's just like you described. He's even wearing that weird fucking sack on his head. He locked his door and looked around. We ducked under the windows. Slowly I crept up. He was gone. He'd leave for hours at a time. So now is our chance, Reagan said. I was about to unlock the door when something hit the car with a loud thud. Shit. I screamed. My windshield was cracked, and it took a second to process what had hit it. It was a fucking human head. horribly disfigured, pieces of it missing. I turned on the car and was ready to gun it when I heard glass break and Reagan scream. She was being pulled out of the passenger window. Just drive. Drive, damn it. Fuck. She kept screaming at me to gun it, but I knew if I drove right now she would either be pulled out or have her back broken. I opened my door and circled around the car. We had no weapons on us, since our plan was to sneak in and call the police from the inside after finding Victoria and Jim. I was about to tackle the guy, but I just fucking stood there. This was no normal fucking guy. His hands were blood-soaked, his nails long and sharp. His movements were erratic and jerky. He pulled Reagan out of the window and tossed her at a nearby wall. She blacked out. "What the fuck are you?" I asked. At least I think I asked. I don't remember if I spoke at all. I was so terrified. "I do not want her. She is filthy," he said. His voice was raspy and low. He stretched out random syllables and would stumble mid-word as well. "I want clean ones only." I fucking turned around and ran, straight into his house. I heard his footsteps behind me, erratic as hell. Thud, 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 thud. I turned my head to see how far away he was. I had a few seconds on him, which normally would have comforted me, but the way he ran, his legs were spread wide and he took gigantic fucking steps, almost like leaps, and flailed his arms. It would almost be goofy if it weren't for that inhuman speed. My lead was quickly disappearing. Then I remembered he locked his door. Well, shit. And here comes this fucking psychopath running at me at full speed. So I turned around and stood there like an idiot. Right before he tackled me, I dove out of the way. He hit the door and fell to the ground. I started kicking him and he was screaming. I saw a metal rod nearby, grabbed it, and smashed him over the face. He stopped moving. I should have decapitated the piece of shit, but Victoria and Jim could have been dying that very moment. I decided to call the police. I found his keys and opened the door. I immediately took out my phone to dial the cops. No reception, typical fucking Sprint. I frantically walked around the place looking for the basement door, checking my phone the whole time. I opened a few doors and found nothing. His house was eerily normal. Finally, 2 bars. I dialed 911 and simultaneously opened a door. Holy fucking shit. I stepped inside before I realized where I was. The smell was putrid, and it was terrifyingly cold. It was a fucking walk-in refrigerator. No shelves, no storage, just an empty and cold room with vents. And a floor covered in meat. Human meat. In some corners it looked like steaks, chopped up with intent. The rest of the place was just blood, body parts, and entrails. It was too late for my shoes. I stepped into what was literally an inch-high pool of coagulated blood. If it weren't for the adrenaline, I would have vomited. I closed the door and got the fuck out of there. I needed to find that basement. I looked at my phone. Call dropped. Fuck. I tried dialing again, but it wouldn't go through. Luckily, I found the basement. I ran down it and turned on the lights. The smell was putrid here as well, but it wasn't rotting meat. It was shit. Literally the smell of piss and shit. On one end of the room, I saw a bed with chains on it, bolted to the floor. Reagan's bed. I looked at the opposite end. It was Victoria. She was completely naked, covered in God knows what, rocking back and forth with her eyes wide open, staring at the wall. She was so skinny. She literally looked like a skeleton. Holy fuck. Babe, Vic, it's me. I'm here and I'll get you out of here. She kept rocking back and forth, slowly, in perfect rhythm. She was staring at a clock on the wall. It was broken, with the second hand repeatedly going back and forth by one interval. Let's go. I screamed. Suddenly, She stopped moving and turned slowly towards me, her eyes still wide. She wasn't blinking. She stared right at me. No, it looked like she was staring through me. Her jaw opened, far beyond the point where it should have. I heard bones cracking, and she bared her teeth. I didn't have time for this shit. I ran to get her. I tripped, and I blacked out. I wish I could say this story had a hero's ending, but it didn't. I was lucky, very lucky. The police traced the call, I guess, and got to me. We all woke up in the hospital. They didn't find this Wendigo psychopath, but they're searching for him. They didn't find Jim either. A horrifying thought went through my mind, and I asked them about that meat fridge. They said it would take them months to run all that DNA, and most of it would be unreliable due to the cross-contamination. Reagan and I were fine, but Victoria was in poor shape. We visited her at the hospital every day for months since then. The police department stationed an officer by her door during the night, for her safety. I thought that was great of them. The guy was real nice, too. Kept her company and genuinely seemed to care about her condition. I wondered if he would be able to protect her if that psychopath showed up again. He was tall as hell and had a gun. I couldn't complain, I guess. I've tried talking about the case with the cop before, but every time he would tell me there was nothing he could tell me. For some reason, I trusted him. Heck, I still do. I had so many unanswered questions about everything, but every time I'd think about asking one, I felt as though I didn't need to. To be honest, I kind of stopped caring about all this anyway. I've moved on, you could say. So much so, I'm not even going to bother to proofread this post. Usually I'd comb through it several times to make sure I didn't make any glaring errors, but I'm just so tired. I need rest. Victoria is still in the hospital, and her condition doesn't seem to be improving that much, but there is always hope. Reagan and I will be waiting for her when she's better. Second story. That's not a deer. A video has been going around recently of someone riding up on a lone deer. In their excitement, they greet it with a cheery, "Hello, deer." As it peers back over its shoulder at the collar, something seems off. This deer has an elongated neck. It stares intently at the person on the quad bike, sizing them up as their neck almost appears to grow longer and their fur becomes increasingly darker. As a viewer, I became unsettled. Feelings of the uncanny valley phenomenon washed over me like a tsunami, though not purely out of fear, out of recognition. If you recognize the term flesh pedestrian, I hope it is because of research and not an encounter such as mine. I was barely fortunate enough to survive the experience. I have always been fond of wildlife and the forest near to my home, roughly a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house. I loved taking my camera and photographing the birds, the fauna, and various fungi that inhabited the woodland around me. Sometimes there would even be the local deer herd grazing in the open field of the clearing or walking through the brush. As a few years went by watching these beautiful creatures on the rare occasions, they would let me glimpse into their world. I took photos to hang in my home of does with their fawns, the alpha male stag with his horns in full glory, and even the young doe with a rare genetically mutated white coat. Though this one particular day shooting, one of my photos was not as the rest appeared. One of the herds stood out, not because of its natural magnificence, but rather because of its repugnancy. In the sunlight stood your usual doe, her reddish-brown coat framing her eyes and ears, but the side where the sun didn't touch. My God, I wish I'd never taken that photo. Her, well, I should be saying its face had flesh hanging from its jawbone, as the meat seemed to have rotted away from its entire face. Its teeth were as yellow as its clearly weathered skull. There was no eye, instead replaced by a hollowed-out socket with a haunting deep red glow. I felt bile rise in my stomach as chills shot up my spine like missiles telling my body to run. My usual 10-minute walk turned into a 3-minute sprint, the country lanes feeling more like death traps than freedom. Leaping the front garden fence, I fumble for my keys, opening the door before slamming it behind me. The feeling of eyes upon me made my skin burn. Peering out of the kitchen window, every late evening shadow appeared as a creature from the setting sun. And there it was. Stood next to bushes at the end of the drive was that thing. Only this time it could barely pass for a deer. Its front hooves morphed into clawed hands, its face hollowed and rotten. Its corpse a mass of blackened, decaying flesh and entrails kept in by a thin, near-transparent layer of skin. It stood on its hind legs before me, taking slow, calculated steps. It raises its leg and covered the front fence in one move. My mouth went dry as I watched, each step making my heart beat faster as it turned into some horrifying beast, the smell penetrating the door as if death itself had tried to claim the creature and failed. I gagged, barely keeping myself together as I moved away from window, to hide behind the door, collapsing behind it as my legs gave way. Tears began to roll down my cheeks as its claws raked down the door. The creature let out a deafening squeal, almost as if a pig and a person were screaming through a siren at the same time. Then there was silence. The smell disappeared as quickly as it came. I waited until it had gotten completely dark before I stood up. I crept towards the kitchen window, staying low. I quietly pulled out the drawer, grasping for a knife. I don't know what for. I guess in hindsight it was a comfort to have at least something to feel as though I could defend myself. As I stood to look outside, the solar lights illuminated the edges of the empty garden. Looking around, I could see nothing. Not the usual fox and her cubs rolling around the wild lawn, nor the owls that frequented the trees. I don't know what made me do it, but I went back to the door and opened it, taking a look outside in disbelief. How had this thing kept pace with me all the way home just to vanish without a trace? The next few days were uneventful. I barely ventured outside, too scared of what I might find, or what might find me. I took a walk early this morning, trying to take some photos of the wild rabbit among the golden brown leaves, some with their whiskers covered in dew, others fighting for territory or the nearest female's attention. The sun shone through the trees as if an autumnal veil was being laid over their branches. I took a moment to breathe in the fresh, cool air and wonder to myself about the day ahead as I checked through my photos, till I noticed something in the background of each one. A deer. I'm writing all of this now as I am trying to walk back to the clearing. I know it's behind me. I think there is another too. I keep looking over my shoulder, but each time I do, the smell is getting stronger and I see more deer. There are 4 currently stood on their hind legs with their front clawed hands wrapped around the trees, watching me with their red eyes, and I know I can't outrun them. I'm going to snap a few photos and start running, but if I don't make it home, I hope whoever finds my camera doesn't look at the horror I have captured. Third story. I should have just went back to my truck. Should have stopped at the deer. Before I begin my story, I want to tell you my rules. These are rules that people have to follow for me to like them. 1. Don't fuck with my family. 2. Don't fuck with my truck. 3. Don't fuck with my gun. And 4. Don't fuck with me. My truck is an old red and white pickup. My rifle is a Lee Enfield Mark I. My name is Liam Summers, the father of a son of the same name. I am a police officer in a Texas town, whilst my son is a soldier in the British Army. His brigade you shall not know, nor shall you know my badge number. I am simply telling you this for identification, if I'm found strung up in my own home. Here's the story. I was driving down a winding forest road at night. It's the kind of forest where, at the edge, the trees are basically a wall. You could try to wiggle through them, but you would either have to be a kid or a skeleton to be able to. Yet, behind the wall, it's very clear, and you could run around if you wanted to. The moon was full, and my truck's lights were at the brightest. so I could see the road perfectly. If I remember correctly, I was driving back from a supermarket or something, and my trunk was filled with food and beer because of that. My rifle rode shotgun with me. No joke intended. My wife always worries when I have the gun up front with me, so she made me put it in a seatbelt. It was stupid, but it gave her peace of mind, so I did it. Probably helped later on that I did strap it in. I turned a corner, and along the road, from one side to the other, was a smear of blood. It looked like when roadkill was ran over by a tire, except along the road. I don't know why, but I thought that it might mean trouble. I parked my car off of the road, didn't want my truck to get wrecked, and, as I parked, my gun jiggled. I looked over at it, thought for a moment, and grabbed it. I pulled the bolt back, loading in a live round. I put it to my chest, and I walked over to the blood. The blood was, as I said, a smear, but sticking out of it, like reeds, was hair. White and brown fibers. The hairs and blood pointed to the left in the woods. Adding to that, the way the blood was. It wasn't some death march of an animal with torn-up hind legs. It was dragged. It just made my brain twitch. It twitched in that way that happens before I kick in the door on a drug house. I took off my glasses and put them in my pocket. I shoot better without my glasses on. Plus, when someone is fucking with me, I take off my glasses. I squeezed through the tree line, barely fitting in. Then I began walking into the woods. I kept my weapon pointed at the ground. The blood made an easy path to follow. The blood was constant, like it was on the road. The woods were quiet, so every time I put my foot down, I either heard the crunch of a stick or the wet crunch of a bloodied leaf. Then, very slowly, I began hearing a scream. It wasn't a constant one. It was a breathy one, as if it had screamed too long and was trying to scream while out of breath. It wasn't a person, but I couldn't have guessed. I kept walking until the scream became louder and louder, and then I found it. In the middle of a clearing was a deer on its back. Its legs were in the air like a dead spider, not moving, but it saw me. The deer's black eyes rolled, and, without seeing its pupils, I knew it was staring. It began the screaming again, and its legs began moving. They were flailing, they span, and every rotation, the bone inside the legs clicked. It took me only a second to realize the legs were broken. The bones made the sound of knuckle cracking, but louder. I slowly raised my rifle up, pointing the barrel towards the head. I breathed in. I breathed out. Clicked the trigger. The bullet pierced through the head, and the deer stopped. The legs went limp and went to the deer's side. I went over to the deer and checked it. I noticed a few things immediately. The legs were broken artificially. There was drill marks on all of the legs. I pulled my handkerchief out of my pocket and squeezed the leg just to check it. A small trickle of blood flowed down the leg, but the trickle began showing bits of white. I noticed quickly that they were solid pieces of bone. I placed the leg back on the ground and let the trickle stop. I put my handkerchief back in my pocket. Then I rolled the deer over. All along its sides were either teeth marks or bites ripped out of the animal. The teeth marks didn't come from animals, though. They looked human. I could see where the molars, premolars, canines, and incisors of a person bit into this poor animal. I kept rolling the animal, and its back was torn up, but there were marks all along the back, cut in by a knife by the look of it. Strange crosses with infinity symbols, a 6 with 2 hooks coming off of it, and what looked like a Star of David in a circle. Then I had some horror struck me. It was the mental equivalent of getting kicked in the back of the knee. The deer wasn't dead when I arrived, and there were only minor bites. Whoever did this must have heard the truck and ran off. In that moment, my instinct said that they must be watching from the trees or from a nearby branch, waiting for me to leave. I should have read the riot act to whatever specter was in the trees. called it a day, and left, but I didn't. I aimed my rifle at the woods and, rotating slowly, scanned the trees for any disturbances. I reached a small area of darkness between two thick branches, right in front of me. It wavered. It twitched like hot air. Being as scared as I was, I yelled out that I was opening fire and shot 2 rounds. One where a chest would have been and one where a head would have been. After the crack of the rifle subsided, there was nothing. There was no scream. There wasn't anything. I slowly advanced towards the darkness, keeping the barrel raised towards it. As I neared, I quickly moved and poked my barrel through the branches, and there was nothing. No fired bullet on the tree opposite, nor a person. I turned back around, and there was a man standing by the deer, but in the shade of the trees. He wore a long gray robe that touched the floor. He had the hood on, the shadow of which had covered his face. I took a knee and took aim again. I cycled another bullet. I yelled at him, asking him what the hell he thought he was doing. He said nothing, but he smiled. His teeth somehow glinted off the moonlight, and it shone them in a whiteness. It was a sinister smile. I repeated my question and aimed my rifle towards his leg. He remained, the smile still on his face. I repeated the question and added that I would shoot him if he didn't answer. His smile disappeared, and I heard an intake of breath, the sort before you talk after getting caught. I eased my grip on my rifle, but there was no answer. It was just the intake. Then he silenced, the smile gone. I tightened my grip. I shouted again, but I said, "Give me an answer, sir, or I'll fire on the count of 5. So, I counted down. 1. He did nothing, just stood there. 2. I noticed that, despite that one intake, the man's coat didn't move like he was breathing. 3. He smiled. 4. I took aim at his chest. 5. I breath in. I breath out. I clicked the trigger. There was flash. He was gone. The bullet thwacked against a nearby tree, but he was gone. He couldn't have run out of the way. He couldn't have done anything human to have gotten out of the way. I should have just ran away, but then again, I don't think I could have. As the crack of the rifle disappeared from my ear, there was a gibbering. Right by my ear. No breathing, just constant gibbering. It was like he was speaking 1,000 different sentences in the space of a single one. I stood there, ramrod stiff, as he just gibbered in my ear, and as certain words lined up in those sentences he was speaking. The words were picture, house, deer, mother, daughter, death. Rule 1 had been broken. After a while of him gibbering, I slowly moved my rifle to my side and jutted it out, trying to jab him in the stomach. I turned, hoping to see him on the ground, but there he was. His face like a 3-dimensional shadow. It had all the details of a face, wrinkles, dips, noise, freckles, but it was made of nothing, of the absence of light. The only thing were his teeth, but they looked like they were made of paper, stuck onto this shadow by accident. The smile soon disappeared in the shadow, and I tried to move away. The shadow didn't follow me as I did. I held my rifle close to my chest as I did this, ready to shoot it if it suddenly jumped forward. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes dead on and my trigger finger locked on its namesake. Then I fell back. I tripped over the dead deer, and, before I could even try to panic, the shadow was there. I clenched my rifle close as it was looming over me, its head slowly tilting back and forth. It slowly stepped out of my vision, and I scrambled up, kicking the deer as I did. I stared at it. My rifle basically stuck to my hands. Its head tilted this way and that way. Its robes were too clean and harsh-looking. It hurt my eyes to stare at them. The robe fell. The robe just fell flat on the floor, and my feet suddenly were sprinting towards where the car was. I passed the tree line and got into my pickup. I tried turning the key and the engine didn't even buzz. Rule 2. So I winded down my window and balanced the rifle on the window, aiming into the woods. I could see the deer clearly. I stayed there for a short while, about a minute or so. Then the shadow moved towards the deer. It was just the shadow. Its robes were gone. The only reason I could see it was how the moon bent around it. It made it look like it was drawn, a two-dimensional thing on a three-dimensional plane. It looked alien, and my brain was thudding in my skull trying to make sense of it. It kneeled down by the deer and began to eat it. It wasn't civil about it. It tore chunks from its neck and swallowed them whole. The meat just disappeared when it touched the shadow. I felt a small twitch in my head and I fired the rifle. The bullet would have pierced through a person and left them for dead. The bullet whizzed and the sound suddenly stopped. The bullet had disappeared into the shadow. The shadow turned towards me and it grew its papery smile. I thought of all the horrible things it could possibly do it to me, so I shut the window. I got my phone from the glove box and called the station. I gave them the road I was on, the state I was in. I didn't tell them about the shadow. I told them, and I quote, "the possibility of a heavily armed and covert individual in the woods." What was I meant to tell them? I waited there, and even though I thought against it, I stared outside at what that creature was doing to the deer. It ripped out chunks of the deer, but they seemed measured, every chunk being the same weight. It stuffed them into its mouth like it had never eaten. It continued like that until the layer of skin was gone from the deer. The shadow began ripping off the legs and chewing them like a chicken leg, just eating and eating. I looked away, hoping to keep my lunch in my stomach. So, I kept my eyes on the darkened road until I saw red and blue flashes. 2 squad cars, one parked alongside my truck and yelled for me to get out and into the car. I did so, and we sped off towards the town. I asked what the other squad car was doing. Luckily, the officer responded by saying they were getting my groceries and that, on the way, they decided to sweep the woods tomorrow for this individual. I told them that was a damn good idea and I went home. To this day, we haven't found a shred of what was in the woods except a deer skeleton and something a little more mysterious. From a tree, nearby the skeleton, hung a sheet of muscle. In it was burned strange writings. It looked like nothing I had never seen before. Different people said different things. Some said Japanese, others said Korean, and even Russian was brought up. Whatever it was, we couldn't read it. So, we bagged in and now, it's probably rotting in an evidence locker. But to this day, I sleep with a light on and my door locked. 4th story. My girlfriend is terrified of deer. I didn't believe her until it was too late. I live in the woods, but not the way most people mean it when they say, I live in the woods. I don't just have a bunch of trees in my backyard. I live on about 10 acres of woodland near a local nature center, in a house my grandfather willed me a few years ago. It's an area I've lived in and around for most of my life, so I'm used to the quirks that come with it. Mostly the wildlife and bad cell reception, but sometimes down trees or snake infestations. My girlfriend Annie is what a lot of people around here would call a city slicker. She lives half an hour away in the closest college town, has an internship at a publishing company, and drives an electric car. We met through some mutual friends who go to the same college, and she doesn't have a problem with driving out to visit me, so we see each other a few times a week. She's a good sport about the bad cell reception, too, and the insects that are constantly trying to get into the house. She doesn't even mind the truck I drive that's older than me, or the suggestion of there being snakes around. In fact, there's only one thing on my property Annie has a problem with, and I didn't notice it until a few months ago. She was driving me back to my place after we'd gone out for dinner and a movie, and it was dark out, the kind of pitch dark it can only really get in the woods. The high beams of her car lit up my gravel driveway, as she turned off onto it, lighting up the corridor of trees around us as brightly as if it was still daytime. Annie hummed along and bobbed her head to the radio, and I leaned back in my seat, checking whatever text messages I could before my cell service took a dive. Suddenly, Annie slammed the brakes. I looked up sharply to see if we had reached the house, or if an animal had run across the road, but there was nothing out there, just more gravel road. I looked to Annie for some kind of explanation, only to find her recoiling from the windshield with an expression as though she'd just seen a big, fat spider skittering across the kitchen floor. Her gaze was locked on something just to the side of the road, and I followed her line of sight to a spot where the high beams were reflecting off of a handful of wide, glowing eyes like glass marbles. A couple of does, and what looked like a young buck, just starting to grow antlers. "They're not gonna cross," I said, thinking that Annie was afraid of hitting them. "I know," she said. "So what?" I said. "You're afraid you're gonna catch Lyme's disease?" "I'm just afraid of them," Annie said, setting her jaw stubbornly. I'm ashamed to admit it now, but I might have laughed. "They're just deer," I said, leaning across her to smack the center of her steering wheel. The car horn sounded in a sudden blast of noise, and the deer scattered back into the woods. "I know they're just deer," Annie said, very clearly annoyed with me. There went any chance of her spending the night at my place. "And I'm still afraid of them. I don't like the way they watch me." She said it like she knew it was silly, and I was tempted to make fun of her a little more, or to tell her a couple of stories, from experience, of just how stupid deer could be, to reassure her that there wasn't much of anything going on behind those reflective eyes of theirs. But part of me could sense that Annie was genuinely freaked out, and I should just leave it alone. Besides, people have all kinds of weird phobias. Being afraid of deer was probably nothing compared to some of those. I put Annie's phobia out of mind, except for the few times she drove me home and I watched her anxiously checking the darkness around my house for deer, recoiling the same way she had that first night whenever she spotted any. Watching her watch the deer made me begin to realize that I had no idea how large the deer population on my property really was. During the day, I would occasionally see groups of 9 or 10 deer grazing on grass at the edge of the treeline near my back porch. Deer of all shapes and sizes, from huge bucks to the tiniest fawns that looked as though they'd just been born. I started trying to keep track of them, to see if it was the same group every time, or different families, but it was hard work. A lot of deer look exactly the same. Even in spite of realizing exactly how many deer lived on my property, I didn't think of them as a problem until the hunter showed up on my doorstep. He drove a truck bigger than mine, a hulking, white thing with an American flag decal plastered all along one side of it, and said he and his buddies had been asked by the nature center to cull their deer population. My property butted right up against theirs, so he offered to send a few guys my way to clear out the woods around my house. "You're culling the deer?" I asked, sounding maybe a little more outraged than I should have been. "Why?" "Just cutting down the population," he said, giving me a look like I had no idea what I was talking about. It made me like him less. To be fair, I didn't know what I was talking about in this particular instance, but I'm not fond of that look. It's a look I get a lot, being a woman who lives alone in the woods. "Why?" I asked again. Surely there weren't that many deer in the woods. "Overpopulation," the hunter said, still giving me that look, like I was asking questions I should already have known the answer to. "Too many deer at the center. Screws up the ecosystem. More chance of people getting Lyme over there, too. And eventually, the deer'll run out of food and starve." When he put it like that, I got the idea that this was a lot kinder towards the deer than the alternative. I could probably deal with seeing less fawns in my yard, if it meant the ones still around had plenty to eat. And less deer meant less for Annie to be afraid of on the nights she came over. "All right," I said with a curt nod. "You can sweep my property too. What do I owe you?" "Nothing," the hunter said. "Our deal with the nature center is we get to keep whatever we kill. Now, you're free to pay extra if you want the meat dash." "That's okay," I said quickly. I thanked him for the offer, then, and retreated back into my house as he walked back towards his truck. I found out from a friend who worked at the nature center that the culling was scheduled to take place early the next morning, practically before the sun came up. I slept with headphones in that night, intent on ignoring any gunshots that came out of the woods behind my house, if there were any to begin with. Did most hunters still use bows? I'd only been hunting a few times with my grandpa when I was in high school, but I remembered being taught to use a bow. Despite the headphones, I woke up close to the crack of dawn like I usually did, when the sun started to pour in from the window next to my bed. I don't go to school, and I have an IT job that lets me work remotely from my laptop, but there's always house chores that need doing, and I like to get them out of the way in the mornings. I was putting out food on the porch for the stray cats that like to come around when I saw it. A trail of fresh blood in the grass right near the tree line, and a deer crawling its way across the ground, all the way down on its belly, like a scared dog. I'd never seen a deer crawl like that before. There was something unnatural about it, something that made me wonder if it was rabid. Judging from the blood trail, it was at least wounded. I stepped back into the house and grabbed my grandpa's shotgun out of the garage. It was old, and I wasn't sure it had ever actually been used. My grandpa had told me it was more for scaring off trespassers than anything. Still, there were a few boxes of shells in the garage, and I loaded the gun with buckshot before taking it outside with me. The deer I'd seen before had vanished, leaving only the trail of blood behind it. I steadied my hands on the barrel of the shotgun, my fingers feeling a little frozen in the early morning cold, and walked into the woods as quietly as I could, mindful that any twig I snapped underfoot would likely send any deer, even a hurt or rabid one, running. I'd been in the woods around my property before, but not often, and following the blood trail led me deeper inside than I'd ever been before. It was strangely quiet back there, except for the occasional rustling of foliage, and the canopy of trees blotted out the sun in a way that left me perpetually in the shade. The blood trail on the ground never dried up, though in fact, it got wider and wetter as I continued to follow it. I was sure that any moment I would come upon a deer that had been half eviscerated, and somehow crawled all the way back to where it thought it would be safe. What I actually found at the end of the blood trail was something worse, something I still see painted on the backs of my eyelids at night when I'm trying to clear my mind enough to fall asleep. The blood trail didn't belong to a deer. Rather, it ended close to a hollow in the trunk of a large tree that a man lay inside. At least, I thought it was a man. I could only see his legs sticking out. A handful of deer stood over him, occasionally lowering their heads down to sniff or lick at the man, and several had mouths that were shiny with blood. I moved closer, cocking the shotgun. The noise startled the deer, and all of them bolted but one, a large doe who stayed right where she was, watching me. A glistening rope dangled from her mouth that I thought might have been part of a hunter's trap, but later realized was a bit of intestine. I took a few more steps forward, watching the doe watch me, until I stood over the hollow in the tree. The man inside was the hunter I'd met the previous day. His bright orange coat was soaked with blood, his chest and abdomen bitten open in more places than I could count, the skin torn away in lazy strips. His skin had turned a sickly gray, and there were strange, round wounds in his neck, like he'd been stuck with a stake or a screwdriver. Antler wounds, I realized, my stomach turning over. I reached out to lift his coat slightly with the end of the shotgun, and recoiled as I caught sight of his ribs through one of the holes the deer had bitten in him. A twig snapped next to me. The doe was still there, still looking at me with her big, glassy eyes, still munching on the rope of the hunter's intestines. I raised the shotgun and unloaded buckshot into her. That was a few days ago, and I haven't left the house since. I called the nature center to ask how the culling went, and they said that half the hunters who went into the woods never came back out. The police came by to ask if I'd seen or heard anything from my property, and I lied. Whoever heard of deer eating someone alive? I've been thinking, though, about what the hunter said to me when he came by, about how when there are too many deer on a property, they start to run out of food. Starve. I've heard before that a lot of herbivore animals will eat meat if they've run out of options. What I haven't heard about is animals like that doing it in a vengeful way, an intelligent way, not eating the nature center employees, but the hunters instead. I haven't seen the stray cats that live around here all week. The food I left out for them that morning hasn't been touched, but I have seen the deer. They've been circling my house all week, crawling on their bellies in the grass like the one that led me to the hunter. I can't help but feel like they know what I did to that doe somehow, like one of them saw me shoot her and passed the knowledge on. Like the deer think I'm a hunter, too. They haven't gotten up to the doors yet, but some of the bucks are on my back porch, looking into the windows. I drew all the curtains in the house, turned off all the lights, but I can still feel their eyes on me, right outside. It can't be long before they try to break the glass. I swear I've heard them tapping on it with their antlers, testing where the weak points are. I've peeked out of the second-floor windows at night, trying to catch them at it, but all I ever see are their reflective eyes shining up at me out of the dark. Annie was right to be afraid.
I'm sorry you doubted her.
Fifth story. The Witchwood Wendigo. Evening came quickly. They left home just past noon, but those 8 hours seemed like nothing. Jeremy and Janessa Atwood were alone in the vast Venetia forest. It was the plan to camp out for a few nights, and they had most of the necessary supplies. They'd taken a cab to the start of the forest, just outside the border of Witchwood. Had their parents even noticed? You think you can get this started? Janessa asked after consistently failing to light the fire. Rubbing 2 sticks together simply wasn't getting the job done. Jeremy walked over, placed some kindling around the larger pieces of wood along with some leaves. He pulled out a lighter that he'd swiped from his parents' room just before they left. Technology. Sometimes it's useful, smirked Jeremy. Why didn't you just hand it to me 10 minutes ago? Janessa groaned. At 16, the Atwood siblings were twins. They shared the same brown hair, though Janessa's reached breast level. His eyes were green, while hers were gray. At 5'4", Janessa stopped growing a year ago, while Jeremy was hoping to add another inch to his current 5'8" stature before adulthood. Jeremy pulled out the necessary ingredients for s'mores. We should probably consider eating an actual dinner, suggested Janessa. We can shoot a rabbit tomorrow, joked Jeremy. Come on, you were supposed to bring actual food along. Jeremy sighed and headed over to his high school backpack. Rummaging through for a moment, he pulled out a small pot and a couple of cans of chunky soup. One of us is gonna have to hold the pot above the fire. Also, we don't have any bowls. Ugh, are you serious? We were kind of in a rush, remember? I just wanted to be out of there ASAP. Janessa grabbed one of the soup cans and peeled it open. Yeah, same here. Shit, this was supposed to be a family trip. They poured the cans into the pot and Jeremy held it over the growing fire. They were surrounded by trees, but none close enough to risk a forest fire. They'd made a point of setting up a fire in a slightly barren section of the forest. The tent was set up nearby. It was large enough for 4 adults, so the twins would have plenty of space that night. You want to give it a try? There are a couple of spoons in my backpack. Janessa took one out and dipped it into the soup. There was a bit of steam coming for the single curly noodle she picked out. She blew on it once before slipping the spoon into her mouth. Good enough for me, she said. Great. Jeremy set the pot down on a slightly slanted rock he'd carried to their campsite about an hour earlier. They ate from the pot as the fire died down slightly. Jeremy placed some more kindling and returned to finishing off the pot. There was still plenty of liquid, which they poured just outside the campsite. Ready for some s'mores? Asked Jeremy. Nah, I'm pretty full, she replied, brushing off the rock where they just ate and taking a seat. Jeremy had grabbed some chopsticks from the kitchen drawer earlier, which he used to cook a couple of marshmallows. They were slightly blackened on the edges when he slipped them between some graham crackers and chocolate. Janessa looked up in the dark blue sky while her brother ate. A few stars were poking out finally. They were half an hour deep into the forest, with the nearest road an additional half hour from Witchwood city limits. Janessa decided to pull out a couple of marshmallows and make her own s'more. Unlike her brother, she didn't mind keeping the marshmallows as is. The chocolate was decent, but it didn't taste as good as she'd hoped. Nevertheless, it was nice to just have some peace and quiet. Afterwards, they cleaned up and put the supplies back in Jeremy's backpack. They sat together around the fire, occasionally adding another log or just kindling. So, have any ghost stories? Asked Jeremy. Not a ghost story. I was thinking a bit about the alleged Wendigo that supposedly lurks around here. Yeah, it's weird that they call it the Witchwood Wendigo, even though this is the Venetia forest, replied Jeremy. It just sounded catchier, shrugged Janessa. Also, aren't they usually located further up north? I think I heard they're supposed to hang around the Great Lake area and the coast. We're a bit off from that down here. They're just myths. You think people would actually camp out here if there were actual cases of people being eaten by some large emaciated creature? Fair point. Then again, how do we know people just haven't been eaten in this forest? We'd have probably heard about a few missing person reports by now. Maybe even some body parts would have been uncovered. It's just fun to speculate. Kinda scary to think about. I guess that's the same as telling ghost stories. Feeling spooked yet? Nah, Janessa shook her head. I feel a lot better than I did earlier. I'm glad we're out here. Yeah, it's good to get away for a bit. I mean, we left a couple of notes out too, so they know we'll be out here another night. There was another minute of silence between them. Janessa looked up at the sky again. Sure enough, there were dozens of stars filling the sky. They lived in one of the more residential regions of Witchwood, where sky was nowhere near as clear as this. It would be cool to go into space one day, said Jeremy. Assuming you can ever get over your fear of heights, teased Janessa. Hey, I can handle heights. At least most of the time. I just don't like being in an observatory 500 feet off of the ground. You're right, it felt pretty weird up there. But that was like 5 years ago. Maybe next time it won't seem so scary. I'm not interested in going back anytime soon. So, still have a thing for Haley Robinson? Nah, kinda lost interest. I don't really have any crushes at the moment. How about you? I think Max is kinda cute. Too bad he's gay. Wait, Max is gay? Nah, but he doesn't really seem to care about girls or anything. He seems pretty asexual. Probably has something to do with those bitches back at his old middle school. What bitches? I haven't told you? Max used to get bullied by these couple of girls named Tess and Kimberly. Apparently it got pretty bad, and that's why he transferred down here. Wow, I had no idea. A big guy like him, I didn't think anyone would try to pick around on. He's kinda shy though. That sucks. Chances are karma will come after them one day. I'm sure of it. There was another silence between the siblings. Jeremy joined his sister in looking up at the stars. She was right. It really was more relaxing out here. Aside from visiting some relatives up in Kentucky, neither of them had been out of Witchwood in close to a year. Spring break was spent around town with friends, while winter break was spent stocking up on groceries just before a surprising blanket of snow. That didn't happen too often in the state of Sanowi. Though it wasn't the deep south, it was southern enough for milder winters and scorching summers. Earlier that day, it went up to 93. Even with the sun down, it was still 80 degrees and quite humid. "One more year before we're out of here," said Janessa. "Still thinking of heading off to college?" "Probably. West Sanowi State isn't an arm and a leg. Plus, I'd get to be in a big city for once." "What about you? Still want to be a detective?" "I might try and get an associate's degree or something to look slightly more qualified. I know a lot of detectives used to be cops, but I'm not sure I want to take that route. You don't need licensing to be a private eye in this state anyway, so my path is reasonably open. We both kinda have that in common." "You want to be a detective too?"
No.
"I mean, we both want to help people. I'd rather focus on high school kids. I've been keeping a journal for like a year now. I want to look back in 10 years and try to remember what it was like being a high school girl. It might help me relate better to students." "It's still weird you actually want to be a high school counselor. I guess we're just unusual kids. Remember when Mom and Dad wouldn't shut up to people about how both of us were left-handed? It's better than being in matching outfits like we had back in kindergarten. I wonder how many other twins had to put up with having their childhoods defined by it." "Yeah, at least we get along most of the time. It's cool being out here and all. I just kinda wish we didn't feel like we had to rush off. If they worry about us, maybe that'll teach them a lesson." "I don't like looking at it that way." Janessa stared sadly at the fire. "Hey, tomorrow's gonna be a good day. We'll head down to the river, skip some stones, and maybe try and catch some fish with our bare hands. Sound fun?" "Yeah." They smiled at one another. The fire died down about an hour later. It was still relatively early, but already they were tired. Before setting up camp, they'd walked around the forest for a while. Since school ended a few weeks back, neither of them had gotten much physical activity. It was close to 10 when they finally headed into the tent with a couple of push-button night lights. They slipped under their sleeping bags with a couple of small pillows and put the lights out. There were crickets chirping and an owl hooting off in the distance. It was peaceful out there. The sounds acted as a lullaby as they twins fell asleep within minutes. Damn it. It was right around sunrise when Janessa awoke to a mild pain in her stomach. She sat up and looked around. That's right. She was out camping with her brother. No bathroom within walking distance either. She moved slowly out of the tent and opened her brother's backpack. "Awesome," whispered Janessa. Jeremy had the sense to pack a roll of toilet paper. It was light out, though the ground was still almost entirely in shade. A few early rays of light appeared somewhat distant. She looked around for an area more dense with trees and headed over. About 7 minutes later, she headed back with the toilet paper roll in her left hand. "Ugh, I really hope he packed hand sanitizer," she muttered. Just then she noticed movement by a tree a few meters to her left. She turned, certain she'd seen some large animal. It seemed as though it was walking upright. No way. What could it have been? Shrugging it off, she headed back to the tent. To her surprise, Jeremy was sitting by the now extinguished campfire. "I have this in case you need it," she said, holding up the toilet paper. Jeremy didn't reply. As she neared him, he turned away from her. His hair was a bit of a mess and looked longer than she'd remembered. "What's wrong?" Janessa tried to get a look at his face, but again he turned away. She walked around, but he kept moving away. Eventually, she started jogging around, yet he was somehow fast enough to keep avoiding her. "Jeremy, what the hell?" She stopped after running around him 5 times. "Are you mad at me or something? Seriously, why aren't you talking to me?" There was some movement back in the tent. Janessa looked over, dropping the toilet paper when she saw what was inside. "Hey, I just woke up. How's it going?" "What the fuck?" Janessa took a few steps back. Jeremy gave her a funny look. She kept her eyes on him, while pointing to the person who looked and was dressed just like Jeremy. Jeremy looked where she was pointing. "Whoa, who's this guy?" Jeremy stepped out of the tent, slipping his shoes on. Janessa kept her distance from both of them. "Good morning," said Jeremy politely. Janessa noticed him pull out a switchblade. "You mind telling us what you're doing outside our tent?" The figure stood up. It was significantly taller than Jeremy. Not only was it taller, but its arms were disproportionately long, fingers reaching the ground when it stood at full height. When the figure turned to face them, it still looked like the back of a person's head. There was no sign of a face beneath the hair. "Oh shit," said Jeremy as he headed over to his sister.
Smoren.
The twins raced off from the campsite. They tried sticking close together as they ran. They weren't sure if the figure was following them, and they had no intention of looking back. They ran past trees for several minutes before stopping behind one that was tall and hollow. "Oh my God, it's real," whispered Janessa. Both of them were trembling and out of breath. "Where the hell is the road?" whispered Jeremy, eyes frantically searching the forest. "I don't know. Maybe we can find the trail or something." They walked close together, constantly on alert. "What the hell was that thing?" asked Jeremy, making fists to minimize the shakiness in his hands. "I don't want to find out," replied Janessa. "There, I think I see the trail." They walked in the direction where she pointed, quickly finding a trail. There were no signs giving directions, but they followed it carefully, still watching every which way. They walked slowly, despite their minds screaming for them to run, or even fly if possible. They were lost in a forest with what seemed to be a real-life Wendigo. This couldn't possibly be real, could it? About 10 minutes after hitting the trail, they noticed their campsite nearby. "We just went in a circle, didn't we?" whispered Jeremy. "Maybe we should get our stuff?" suggested Janessa, moving off of the trail slightly. Jeremy clutched her hand tightly. "No way. We need to find a way out of here. We should get some stuff. Maybe we can throw it at that thing if it starts chasing us again." Jeremy looked around and let out a long sigh. "Shit. I still think this is a bad idea," he grumbled as they headed back to the campsite. Jeremy grabbed his backpack, pulling out the pot from last night. Janessa tapped him on the shoulder and pointed at the tent. It was zipped up again. They exchanged looks and quietly crept away. As they did, the zipper opened. Janessa mouthed something but made no sound. Popping out were a pair of heads. Both had long hair, albeit with bald patches. Their faces were dirty and their skin was an ashy gray. They looked dead. The heads looked around, but didn't seem to notice the twins. Jeremy tugged at Janessa's left hand, and the pair took off running again. They raced back on the trail, running as fast as they could. Up ahead, Jeremy noticed something walking past the trees. Its body was severely emaciated, its long arms accompanied by massive hands and branch-like fingers. "Oh shit," whispered Jeremy. He tugged at his sister and pointed in the adjacent direction of the creature. They rushed off of the trail, and back into a denser part of the forest. As they ran, they could hear something moving behind them. The sound was getting louder. It was like a large animal stampeding. Jeremy noticed a tall tree with a couple of low-hanging branches. "Up here!" he cried and lunged for the nearest branch. He pulled himself up first and immediately climbed the second.
Small.
He yelled to his sister, refusing to look back. He must have been 10 feet up when he heard her scream.
No.
Despite the season, there weren't too many leaves on this tree. He stared down and saw Janessa on the ground. Frantically, she flailed her arms around, trying to push something off of her. But there was nothing there. Nothing that could be seen, at least. He almost called out to her again, but fell silent when her shirt ripped. Claw marks appeared with blood spilling out. Janessa screamed again, while Jeremy watched in horror. A couple of seconds later, her right eye was punctured by something. He watched as the eyeball was pulled from the socket. The screams were unbearable, but there was nothing he could do to escape. There was blood on the right side of her face now, as the creature continued to mutilate her. She kept putting up a desperate fight as her left eye was also sucked out of its socket. Jeremy held tightly to the branch at his chest level, unable to look away. The struggles carried on for several more minutes. The girl didn't even look like Janessa anymore. Her eyes were gone, and a significant chunk of the right side of her face had been eaten away. In spite of this, he could still hear gargled screams as she kept flailing about on the ground. Her shirt had been mostly ripped away, leaving a torso covered in blood and innards. How was she still alive? And why couldn't he look away? The screams finally died down, as did Janessa's movements. The whole time Jeremy couldn't see the thing that was attacking her. It was completely invisible. Was it still the Wendigo? He heard movement, as though something large was walking away. He even saw what looked like massive paw prints appear in the ground below. The movement quieted, leaving behind the mutilated, almost unrecognizable corpse of Janessa Atwood. Her throat had been ripped apart, her innards spilling from her torso, those sockets picked clean. No movement, no signs of life. Jeremy hung on for dear life. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of nightmare. The ground was spinning, so it had to be a dream. This had to be some sort of nightmare. Why wasn't he waking up? He didn't know how long he stood there, but he'd surely spent the entire morning staring at his sister's corpse. He could never leave. If he tried to get down, that thing would do the exact same thing to him. He was alone in Venetia forest with a corpse and a Wendigo. He'd probably never see his parents again. Janessa certainly wouldn't. And in her current state, they'd probably never see her again either. Hours passed. Jeremy continued to search the forest, listening carefully as ever. There were no further signs of the Wendigo, or whatever the hell that creature was. At this point, he no longer wanted to risk looking down. Janessa's corpse was down there. He didn't want to comfort it anymore. He couldn't. His arms were tired, but it was better than being ripped to pieces. Jeremy?
No.
It couldn't be. From below, Jeremy heard Janessa's voice. But she was dead. Even in the off chance that she was barely alive, she wouldn't last much longer. I can't see you, Jeremy. I can't see anything. Go away, whispered Jeremy. You're dead. You're not real. Go away. There was silence again for another few minutes. Jeremy shut his eyes, resting his head on the branch he was holding. He was so tired, completely drained. Brother, where are you? I can't see anything. His eyes opened, wide and alert. It wasn't real. He had to be hallucinating at this point. I don't want to be stuck like this, Jeremy. Please pull me up. I'm scared all alone down here. Tears spilled from Jeremy's eyes. It must have been guilt. He didn't stop at the first branch. He could have probably helped her up. He could have probably saved her. Then again, maybe both of them would be lying dead on the ground. He tried. Scratching. Something was scratching at the trunk of the tree. I don't want to be alone down here, said Janessa sadly. Jeremy, save me. The scratching grew louder. He held to the tree branch tighter than ever. You're not real, he insisted. You're just a figment at this point. Now get out of my head. The scratching was accompanied by footsteps and what sounded like talking. Jeremy, save me. Janessa's scream was like that of a banshee. It was hypnotic. Jeremy found himself looking back down. Janessa's eyeless corpse was standing right by the tree, scratching at it with inhumanly long nails. She was looking up at him, most of her face missing, dirt in her hair. Jeremy screamed, "Help me! Oh God! Somebody! Somebody! I'm losing my mind! Help! Help me! Oh my God, she's dead! My sister's dead! Please don't let me end up like her! Save me! Help me!" Rescue at last. Right as he was screaming, a couple of men happened by. Despite their presence, Jeremy remained in a panicked state. He refused to climb down. Close to an hour later, police arrived at the scene. A balding, middle-aged cop was able to talk Jeremy down from the tree once Janessa's body had been taken away. Once he was back on the ground, he could barely stand. The cop, whose name was Oscar, wasn't a large man, but he had enough strength to carry the traumatized Jeremy in his arms. Not long thereafter, Jeremy's parents arrived. He didn't speak to them at all that night. Once his feet were on the ground, he'd blacked out. He was taken to a hospital for inspection. He sustained no major injuries, though he'd been physically worn down. He ended up sleeping for 14 hours in a hospital bed. Luckily, he didn't have any dreams that night. Despite yesterday's trauma, he claimed not to recall much of anything that happened. He knew Janessa was dead, but he didn't remember anything else. About a week passed and Jeremy was up in his bedroom. He hadn't left since returning home. His parents hadn't been up to see him either. Aside from some brief conversation at the hospital, he hadn't spoken with his parents at all. Apparently, Janessa's funeral happened earlier that day. He heard his parents talking about it that morning, but they decided not to ask him along. He was unsure how he felt about that. The reality is that he didn't want to go. The last thing he remembered was hearing her talk to someone outside the tent that morning. His parents signed him up for therapy, which he'd begin in a few days. Were they going to try and force him to remember what happened? He didn't want to remember. He sat there at the desk in his bedroom, staring blankly at his computer. All he wanted to do was try and move on. But how could he? He hadn't experienced any nightmares in the week since the incident. It surprised him that he had so little recollection of the events of that morning. Though he wanted to forget, he also wanted to understand. What happened to Janessa? Jeremy reached into his closet and pulled out a brown cap. He'd forgotten to wear it on the trip, even though he considered it a top priority right before leaving. It was probably better that he didn't, otherwise he'd associate it with the trauma. He'd gotten rid of the clothing he wore on that day. He really wanted to distance himself from anything he could remind him of that day. He slipped on the brown cap, feeling the edges. It had been a birthday present from Janessa earlier that year. He felt the need to turn it backwards. It was a change in style that felt right. At the moment, a map of Venetia County was displayed on his computer. He looked at the section labeled as forest. He placed his finger on the screen, causing it to move slightly. "I'll remember eventually," he whispered, eyes unable to look away from the screen. "I want to know what happened to you. I just don't want to find out today." Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.